All right, good morning. Welcome back here to Trader Minute. Great to have you aboard. S&P futures up about 22 points here this morning, which indicates about a 16-point open higher when you take into account, or excuse me, an 18-point open higher when you take into account fair value. You can see futures trading above yesterday's highs here this morning. And, most of the gains really coming during the Asian session or while China was open. And you see this bump up right here, and this is about 9 o'clock, just before 9 o'clock my time, and I'm in the Mountain Time Zone, so just before 11 Eastern. And you see this kind of, about 8-point bump higher in S&P futures, and with some volume here on it. Whenever you see something like this overnight, you know it's news out of Asia, right? That's a dead giveaway. It's news out of Asia, and that's what it was. It was news from China that they had announced some swaps here. I posted the link into the feed, or one of the links into the feed. But basically a monetary stimulus measure that they announced here overnight to allow the banks to refresh some of their Tier 1 capital levels overall. And there's this kind of idea out there, and I think it's a very interesting notion, and one that deserves some respect. But this idea that China is ready to open the floodgates in terms of monetary stimulus. Now, can they do that without, depreciating the dollar all that much? Well, does it matter? Because U.S. President Trump doesn't like the dollar this high anyway. So, if in terms of the political, but overall, that's kind of the news. That's the mention. That's the driver here this morning. The big driver here this morning. Then we get later on the information that Chinese delegates are coming on Monday. That trip is happening, where they will be here in the U.S. on Monday. So that does open up some of the encouraging signs that trade war may alleviate a little bit as we go forward. So two kind of news events, really kind of driving things here this morning. We also have earnings going on. And, earnings happening here. And there are two that I want to go take a look at here with you this morning. One is Intel, and the other is Western Digital. And, Western Digital reported this morning, Intel last night. And, I misspoke there. They both reported last night. My apologies. But we had Starbucks, Western Digital, and Intel that were the big reports here. The big reports here yesterday. I haven't gone through Starbucks yet. I'll be doing that here today. You can see Starbucks, really sold off in those first few minutes after the bell, but is set to trade slightly higher, pretty much just slightly higher than where it opened yesterday. But there was this notion yesterday, and I heard it on TV. I turned on one of the news channels just to have it in background noise a little bit, and they were talking about Intel earnings upcoming, and the comment was made that somebody knows something about Intel earnings, that somebody knows that there's going to be a really big earnings report here, and that's why this stock gapped up yesterday, and that's why it's driving higher on volume. Somebody knows something, right? And he may be absolutely right. Somebody knew something. But, what's the reaction here in the stock on Intel after their earnings? Well, quite the opposite. It's down about 350 where it sits right now. But you can see it fell from 40 all the way down, 50 all the way down to 45.5 here in a sizable drop. So it's set to open up, down here near the lower Bollinger Band this morning, a little bit higher since the, little rebound that it's had this morning. We've seen two analysts come in and downgrade it here. But Intel earnings, I think they're there's something I think you can find some positives in them. Just as I went through them, there's some positives, but you can see earnings per share they did beat expectations. Revenue though they missed. They missed on revenue. They missed expectations, and some nice revenue growth quarter over quarter. Right. In fact, the comparable is actually very nice, but the market's not going to give you credit for the comparable unless you beat the expectation, and that's what we see here with Intel. I don't think it speaks too much of the global economy or anything else out there. I think it's much more of an Intel specific story. And, it's typical Intel. Typical Intel. They are going to be losing a little bit of a growth driver when they let Micron, or when Micron takes over, the IM flash portion of things. But overall, that's Intel. A lot of analyst commentary on it this morning. But I show that more not to talk about Intel, because I think Intel's a boring stock. I don't like following it. I never have, and it's one that occasionally I'll jump into at certain levels. But overall, it's one that I show just simply because of this notion of, oh, well, you know what? If it rallies big ahead of earnings, somebody knows something, and if it sells off ahead of earnings, somebody knows something. That's typically not the case, though. If Intel had gapped up, on some great earnings, right, all the speculation would be, yes, of course, somebody knew something, and today it'll be forgotten. But the one where I think the earnings are a lot more interesting, and the stock I think is a lot more interesting. We've been talking about this for the last 2 weeks, and we've broken down the fundamentals and how cheap it is, and I talked about it being one of my favorite earnings plays is Western Digital, and they reported after the bell yesterday, and this morning they're set to gap up to 45. They're set to gap up here to this $45 level, and this is after trading in the mid 30s here last week. So a pretty sizable move, but in terms of what Western Digital can do, it's not exactly huge. But this is a company that went into the earnings report with an absolutely dirt cheap fundamental picture. You could see the earnings they missed, right? I mean, they missed on their earnings. They missed on the earnings by 6 cents. And look at the big earnings drop-off. I mean, the big earnings drop-off. Intel's way better than that, right? You look at the revenue, and the revenue missed. And you sit here and go, whoa, wait a minute. Revenue missed, quarter over quarter, it's down. Yeah, it's going to look to stabilize a little bit. But, man, this looks way different than Intel, right? And Intel's down big and Western Digital's up big. And, that to me speaks to the valuation more than anything, in terms of what is expected and what the bar is for the stock. We did talk about the short interest in it, and this is one where the short interest was a little bit higher, but basically Western Digital downgraded here at Stifel with their price target lowered from 60 down to 48, right? Citigroup lowered their price target from 75 to 63. BMO Capital lowered their price target from 50 to 43. Right, we have all the analysts jumping in and lowering their lowering their price targets here on it. It's one of those situations here where the guidance is, really helping to push this stock higher as they talk about cost cuts, as they talk about, future guidance being a little bit better than expected. And when you have here to it, and that's what we're seeing here in Western Digital this morning. I don't know that the earnings report is good enough to keep the stock held up and pushing higher. It had earnings and now off to the races it goes. I suspect we may see a consolidation quarter, and then next quarter, if they do show the turnaround, then boom, we will see the stock off to the races, and that's what I'll be looking for here. But Western Digital, this is one we talked about. We've talked about the different options that were available to trade it here with earnings, and it is something that you don't see it very often. You don't see this situation set up all too frequently, but a absolutely dirt cheap stock with very low expectations going into earnings, and so it doesn't take much. It just absolutely doesn't take much for it to rally big. We still have stocks like U.S. Steel that are in similar positions where, they're pretty darn cheap. They're pretty darn cheap on a historical basis. Expectations are pretty low. And, one that could definitely see some sizable upside, even on a type of report here. So, we have Intel, we have Western Digital. You can obviously see from the reactions of what the earnings were that the expectations going into the two were vastly different, and that is in play here this morning. Now, going into the open here this morning, I have a position on the XLF, and this has been one of those where so far it's death by 1,000 knife cuts. It just hasn't gone anywhere except every day it just kind of closes up 3, 4, 5 cents, right? And so getting the bleed, getting the option, not a ton of implied volatility coming out. There's just not a lot to come out of it. But it is something that this morning it's going to gap up here with the market, probably about 15 cents. I'm going to have a decision to make. I'm going to have a decision to make of what I want to do with it. Do I want to take it do I want to take it here this morning and move on from it, take that cash and go with something else? Do I want to ride it here into the weekend and into next week, which I'm not leaning towards, but I'll have that decision to make. So this is something where, do I take what I have left and go put it in some U.S. Steel ahead of earnings? You could argue I probably should have done it with the challenge with Western Digital, but that was something where I didn't think I was down to that point here just yet. But those will be some of the decisions that I have to make here today. I haven't made any decision here just of yet. I just kind of I can't help but wonder, and looking at the opening landscape of the market here today, and this is a gap that is a different gap, right? This gap is going to be a little more sizable than recent gaps, but I can't help but wonder if we don't see one of those big, bad, bearish engulfing days, come in after the gap up here this morning. And I just, that's my suspicion. I don't have a whole lot of evidence to suggest it, but it is something that, the China news could definitely mean that doesn't happen, right? If we were seeing this gap up and there wasn't the China news, you'd hear me say, yeah, we're looking at a very high probability of a reversal today. But that China news lowers that probability. But I think it's still something that's, very possible, and I think has to be watched out for here overall. So, if we start to see signs that that's coming in, I'll hold the XLF. If we see signs that it's not going to come in, then I'll look to pull it and look to adjust. All right. I have been asked what the next step for the challenge is, and going forward here, and that is something that I'll discuss if that happens. But bottom line is, me, I love to trade, and I will keep going. I'll change it up a little bit here from time to time, but we'll start a new challenge and get off and rolling. Thanks for hopping on. Have yourselves a great one, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.